Okay, so we've gone over all kinds of different things, Dr. Feagin, and they have been also really informative for both thinking about how we learn about history, teach about history, and then how we conceive of inequality in the US today. And so, from a perspective of being a little hopeful in this context, what are some of the ways that you think the average person in the US can address racism?
Well, there are lots of ways. There are dozens, probably I guess hundreds, of anti-racist groups that are training people of all backgrounds, some of them specialize on whites, to first understand this timeline and this intergenerational transmission of privilege and wealth, and the anti-racist movements in which whites did participate significantly, learning this real history and then deframing the white racial frame and reframing it to an authentic liberty and justice frame. This country's really good at rhetoric. Yeah, the founders, you have to give them credit. You know, they let the cat out of the box, right, and said liberty and justice for all. We hold these truths, all men are created equal. Now, they didn't practice it, but they did announce grand ideas, right, that have been taken very seriously, especially by these civil rights movements, trying to make it real. And their groups, one that I've helped a little is called ASDIC, ASDIC. It's an anti-racist dialogues group in Minnesota. It's had, I think, 2,500 dialogue groups. Their rule is it's not a one-shot workshop. You have to commit to something like 3 hours on 12 Saturdays, something like 10 or 12 Saturdays.
Yeah.
Long-term discussions about how racism works in this country. They use my white frame idea. These are interracial groups, maybe 20, 25 whites and people of color who commit to dialogue about what racism is in this country, how it works, and what we can do about it. And like I said, they've done 2,500 of these groups. They work with church groups. They develop a curriculum for the schools on anti-racism. They've had a lot of online workshops. There are probably at least 100 other groups like them that are working every day and which whites and others can join and become part of these committed groups that are committed to deframing and reframing that white frame, to enforcing the civil rights laws and discussing why we don't, to organizing, like in the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, in, what was it, summer, 2020, 21, I guess, we had about 25 million Americans protesting against police brutality and other systemic racism issues. Unfortunately, it didn't last. Whites who participated, white young people especially, participated heavily in those movements. Many of them, over half the participants were white. And some of those whites moved into civil rights organizations and anti-racist groups, but many of them just kind of withdrew and into the woodwork. And there wasn't a long-term commitment there. But it was good to see them chanting Black Lives Matter and systemic racism. You know, I helped coin that term systemic racism back in the 70s, and it was very strange to see millions of people chanting systemic racism. But clearly we need to show them ways to keep that chant going and that interest going and a deeper commitment to racially desegregating and integrating this society.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So what gives you hope? This is our last question for you. What gives you hope right now?
Hope is hard right now, of course, because we seem to be moving backwards. Donald Trump was the first overtly white nationalist presidential candidate and president, probably since Warren Harding, 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. And he seems to get worse by the day. And we've got a lot of white extremists organizing against attempts to teach an honest history. So it's hard. And I think the only way to counter that is to organize. The majority of the people in this country are good people. Most people who have anti-racist inclinations don't get them reinforced in their own personal groups, family and friends. They need to find some of these organizations like ASDIC and join with those folks where you're not only learning about racism and creating an honest multiracial democracy, but you also got friends, new friends who will support you in that effort. And since whites are still the majority of this country, this is especially a white obligation to make that Declaration of Independence rhetoric about all men are created equal real. I love the rhetoric of this country, right? And we moved in that direction in fits and starts. We just need to restart that engine.
Yeah. And stay committed to sustained engagement.
Indeed.
Right.
That's why I like ASDIC, because you just don't go to one meeting.
You keep going.
You commit to a series of meetings, and you can't dodge your own racist thinking and framing.
Right. You really ought to engage.
When you do this 3 hours over 10 or 12 Saturdays, right, with people of color, if you're white, and of course people of color are learning too in these sessions. And then some of these groups or local groups will engage in anti-racist action. We just need to multiply that by 1,000.
Right. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Feagin. This has been really great. I appreciate this interview so much. Is there anything else you would like to say or add at this point before we let you go?
I just remember Frederick Douglass famously, toward the end of his life, was asked, I think by a young black man came to visit him, and asked him for what would Frederick Douglass give a young black man in terms of advice. And he looked at the young black man and said, organize. 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 And in one of his most famous speeches, Frederick Douglass said something like, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. And his point is that change comes when people struggle and organize. He called it earnest struggle. Another part of that speech is if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Now that's coming from a black man who was enslaved like the first 18 years of his life. he fought the slave breaker, the guy who was sent to break him, to a draw, and eventually fled slavery to become one of the most brilliant authors and speakers of all time, including one of the key abolitionists who convinced Mr. Lincoln to bring those black soldiers into the American Army, the U.S. Army. So, if there's no struggle, there is no progress. And part of that is something like those who profess to favor freedom, yet depreciate agitation, are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. Power concedes nothing without a demand. Yeah. Brilliant words.
It is. It is. And really, that call to engage, right? You have to engage. You got to do it. All right.
There's an old saying, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. It's really eternal organization for liberty is the price of liberty, right? Eternal organization is the price of liberty.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Feagin. This has been really great. We really appreciate it. And thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Take care.
Great. Thanks.